one of the brightest, in my view, and I'm not flattering here, intellectuals of our time, Dr. Anatol Ливен, professor of international politics at Georgetown University, Doha campus, and he was also a senior fellow at the New America Foundation. We're also fortunate to have with us, even though she's not with us right now, but she'll join us in a minute, Dr. Anastasia Likachova, director of the Center for Comprehensive European and International Studies at the Higher School of Economics, and she'll be a discussant for our today's book. Most of us actually know Professor Ливен is a prolific and insightful writer who authored many interesting books on a variety of subjects, from Chechnya to Pakistan to Russia's relations with Ukraine to American nationalism. And today we are to listen to his presentation of the latest book that he authored, Climate Change and the Nation State, The Case for Nationalism in a Warming World. So needless to say that the issue of climate change has been gaining tremendous importance and attention globally. And what I found of particular interest in Professor Liven's book are actually two things. Well, I mean, there are many things, of course, but I just wanted to single out these two in this intro for our audience to have a better grasp of what exactly Anatol wrote in his book. So, and actually these things are in the introductory part of his book, and he mentioned, and I'm quoting here, that this book has its origins in a growing sense of alarm, of frustration, and of futility, and as international efforts to reduce emissions have failed repeatedly to meet their targets, even as warning by experts about the existential dangers of climate change and the need for haste have grown, I developed a stronger sense of the comparative irrelevance of most of the issues on which I have been working in the areas of international relations and security studies. A revelatory moment came when I was researching the growing tension between the United States and China, and I suddenly realized that as a long-term issue that places these places, and Professor Ливен is referring to the South China Sea, will be meaningless for both sides, because if nations, and China and US in particular, fail to take action to limit climate change, then by the end of the century, rising sea levels and intensified typhoons will have put them underwater again. So when I was reading these things, I caught myself thinking, wow, that's really interesting, right? Because we're all kind of focused on this new Cold War and all this, common struggle between the US and China. But then comes Professor Ливен and says, hey, all of this stuff may actually be irrelevant if we fail to tackle this greatest, challenge of climate change. So that was a very interesting point. And the second one I thought was interesting, that Professor Ливен mentioned that this book is in part an appeal to my fellow realists and to sensible and patriotic policymakers all over the world to reassess the interests of their nations in view of the overwhelming evidence for the severe danger posed for future of these nations by climate change. And I was preparing for this book talk. I've looked at some of the critique of the book and realized that many actually criticized Professor Ливен, saying it's not really a case for realism, right, that he's making. It's something different. But we'll be happy to listen to Professor Liven's ideas on these matters. But before we do so, just quick notes on the rules of thumb here. Professor Ливен will deliver his remarks for about half an hour or so. Then our discussant will make her comments on the issue and on the book. Then we'll have Professor Ливен respond to the comments and then do the Q&A. So that'll perhaps have us for about an hour and a half. This is a reminder that this event will be in English and is live streamed on the Imim Gimoa YouTube channel. And the recording of this event will also be available at that same YouTube channel. So thank you very much for being with us today. Professor Ливен, over to you.
Thank you so much, Maxime, for your very kind introduction and for inviting me. I'm really delighted to be speaking here. I hope to do so again in the future. Yeah, a lot of people were very surprised that I, moved from my old field of international relations, security studies, reporting on various countries around the world when I was a journalist, to this area of climate change. But I would say I've simply joined quite a lot of other people who were not, by previous experience or activity, environmentalists, but who have simply been convinced by the evidence. For example, famous British economist Nicholas Stern, Lord Stern, who wrote a famous report on climate change a few years ago. And as he said, he simply looked at the scientific evidence. He looked at the scientific consensus. He's not a scientist any more than I am, but given the evidence and given the level of consensus, I feel that to reject this, to reject the evidence for the existence of anthropogenic climate change and its enormous danger, you basically have to reject science. Well, now, of course, this is what fundamentalist Christians in the United States do, but I don't think there's any need for the rest of us to follow in their footsteps, right? So yes, I just became convinced by the evidence of this. And the more I read, as you said in your introduction, the more I became convinced that so many of the issues, and actually the overwhelming concentration of our states, of our security elites in international affairs at present, will be seen by historians 200 years from now, even 100 years from now, assuming, of course, that there are any 200 years from now, as comparatively minor, even perhaps virtually non-existent compared to the threat of climate change, if, of course, we fail to limit it adequately. And as a historian, and as the brother of a famous historian, Anatolь Ливен, I must say I've always had in the back of my mind the memory of what happened in 1914, when all the state elites of Europe, believing that they were behaving in an entirely realist fashion in their attitudes and in their policies towards each other, succeeded in totally missing the point. That the threats that they posed to each other were, in fact, minor compared to the internal threats to them in every country, which were then, of course, released by their war with each other that started in 1914. And looking back from the perspective of more than 100 years, even when one has learned as much as possible about them, how they thought, how their attitudes were shaped, I can't help feeling there must still be a feeling, how could they have been so stupid? And I think that that is the way that people in future will look at us, or not us today, but our leaders and their advisors in future, if we fail to get a grip on this issue, and if we go on being obsessed, or if they go on being obsessed about comparatively minor ones. And of course, there is the incremental threat of climate change, a not exactly gradual, certainly not gradual in terms of climate history, but still posed by a relatively slow rise in temperatures with very severe results, but over a period of time. By the way, this of course has already begun. If you look at temperature rises, wildfires, and so on, droughts. But there is also this threat of what has been called tipping points, leading to feedback loops, reciprocal relationship, release of methane from the Arctic permafrost being one of the greatest risks in this regard, leading to runaway climate change. Now, it is impossible to put a precise degree of risk on this, let alone a precise date. And any attempt to do so is, I think, profoundly mistaken and even fraudulent. But if you look at the evidence, this is a real possibility. Not a probability, pray God, but a possibility. Now, if this happens, it is really no exaggeration to say that the whole of modern civilization and all existing nation states will be threatened. And this brings me now, this book is directed to security elites all over the world, indeed populations all over the world. From the purposes of your institute, it does have a particular, it is particularly directed towards the United States. But I do also look at other countries. There is a long section on South Asia and the particular threat to countries there, simply because, of course, they are already much closer to the edge in terms of temperature, in terms of water shortages, it won't take that much more in terms of temperature rises to have a disastrous effect on South Asian agricultural production. But there is also a section looking at Russia, because of course Russia is one of the places where a lot of people feel, as in Canada too, that Russia will not suffer too badly from climate change and may even gain advantages from it as a result of the warming of northern areas. As I say in the book, this is not an argument without merit from a narrowly Russian point of view, but there are two huge objections. The first is that this would only work if climate change is relatively slow. Because if it turns out to be much faster, agriculture cannot adapt that quickly. Even assuming, of course, that large areas of Siberia or northern Canada are appropriate for agriculture at all, which they may not be. But the second point is that even if, from a purely climate point of view, Russia is less affected, Canada cannot isolate itself from the United States and Central America to the south. The idea of closing that border is a non-starter. Russia, as the largest state by territory in the world, with huge borders with Asia, will not be able to insulate itself from the collapse of states further south, with populations in the hundreds of millions, if climate change gets seriously out of hand and essentially destroys those states, their economies and organized societies. Russia will face a degree of migration, as will Europe, by the way, which it will be very difficult for any organized state to withstand, at least without the most methods so ferocious that they would recall some of the worst aspects of Russia's and Europe's past. So that is a particular section devoted to Russia. By the way, I have quite a lot on the threat of migration being greatly increased by climate change, both, of course, in South Asia and in West Africa. This is perhaps the section of the book that has made me most unpopular with the sort of usual mainstream left, who I have to say have a kind of blind spot about the dangers of migration in terms of destabilizing societies, which can almost be compared to the blind spot of some of the right in America and elsewhere when it comes to climate change. So the book is a call for clarity of thinking and realism on a range of issues. So from this, the book then is an appeal to security elites and to fellow realists, basically to be realistic, to do what realists are supposed to be good at, but are not always good at, which is looking at the evidence, assessing the evidence, assessing risk, and recognizing, once again, the full extent of the risk of climate change. And here my realist background really comes in, the danger of climate change to humanity in general, but also, which I mean follows directly, this isn't a contradiction in any way, the threat of climate change to existing states, to the security and the stability of existing nation states, which after all, our security elites, our soldiers, are sworn to defend. Now, and if it comes to defending the national interests and in future perhaps even the national existence of our states, well, it doesn't matter, or it shouldn't matter from that point of view, what direction these threats come from. It is their responsibility to act against it in the interests of their states. And the argument I make here as well, principally towards the United States, but not wholly by any manner of means, is that if one could also really concentrate the attention of the security elites on the threat of climate change, this would be a great help in two respects. Firstly, in winning over people, both in the elites and in the mass of the population, who are culturally and politically not inclined to listen to the standard environmentalist camp, who are culturally, especially in the United States, of course, simply configured not to listen to them, to react against them. And I talk about the idea which comes out of a particular school of IR, the so-called Copenhagen School, of a speech act by an authoritative actor or set of actors, which redefines an issue as a security issue, against which all the resources of the state have to be mobilized, as happens in war, but actually has happened to a considerable degree during the Cold War as well. And as I'm afraid, a lot of the language of the Biden administration about China suggests that this is the way that they're going to try to go again in this new Cold War. So try to refocus the attention of security elites on the security of their states. This leads to the next point. The next point, which also, of course, comes straight from realism, which is the centrality of the state. I mean, this is, of course, key to realism. You can't really be a realist unless you see states as central to what goes on. I have to say from that point of view that I did become increasingly exasperated with a large part of the Western environmentalist literature, which still is written as if the only way that we can struggle successfully against climate change is essentially if nation states are greatly weakened, or in some cases even disappear. I remember one writer was talking about the cancer of Westphalia, as if basically nation states are a disease which must vanish. Well, as I say in the book, if we have to wait for serious action against climate change for nation states to vanish, there will be no action. They will vanish, but as a result of catastrophic climate change. And I think that my argument from this point of view has, unfortunately, it's not that I like this fact, even as a realist, but I do think that this argument has been borne out by what has happened during the COVID pandemic. Of course, international cooperation is desirable. It's played a useful role. It could, of course, have played a much more useful role, but in the end, it has been states that have taken the necessary action, and to a considerable degree, it has only been states that could take the necessary action, because only they have the institutions, the power, and the legitimacy to impose the often extremely harsh measures, at least by Western standards over the past generation, necessary to control this pandemic. The experience of East Asia also shows that it has been states, not just authoritarian states, by the way, not just China, but also South Korea, Taiwan, Japan, which have really succeeded in getting a grip on the pandemic and basically controlling it from the start. Strong nation states enjoying legitimacy and respect in their population and able to convince their populations to accept and implement these measures. So the book is not, I say repeatedly, I am not condemning in any way international movements or international organizations or international protest campaigns. They're all good, but I think we need to recognize that in the end, their purpose is to get states to act, to put pressure on governments, on parliaments, and to try to convince populations, electorates in the West to vote for the necessary measures. So states remain central. That led me to the issue of nationalism and the role of nationalism in the struggle against climate change, something which I think it's fair to say very few people have talked about. I feel I am somewhat path-breaking in this regard. And I was led to this, by the way, call it patriotism, if you will. I regard this as a distinction without meaning. And I say repeatedly in the book that I am, of course, talking about different kinds of civic nationalism, including Russian state nationalism in its own way, not ethnic or chauvinist nationalism. But I was led to this, of course, naturally by a recognition of the central importance of the nation state, but also by two other things. The first is the critical obstacle, as has been said again and again and again, to action against climate change by this generation, involving sacrifices by this generation, when the really bad effects will only affect future generations. Now, by the way, in some parts of the world, this is, this is not actually future generations. If you look at what's happening in Australia, if you look at the very serious predictions in South Asia, whereby the World Bank thinks that, if we continue on present trajectories, essentially India will begin to decline economically by the middle of this century. As I keep telling my students, I'll be dead by then, but you won't. Generations alive today will begin to experience this. But clearly the most catastrophic results, if God forbid they happen, will be further down the line. So how do you get present generations to make sacrifices for future generations? And as those of you who've read in this subject know well, this leads some of the economists into, really quite surreal and grotesque discounting of trying to judge in mathematical terms how much, the interests of somebody alive in 2100 or 2150 is compared to people alive today. And alas, all too often, you add up these figures and it turns out basically they don't have any interests at all compared to us. Their interests are 1/80th of our interest today. That is not a very helpful way of approaching this issue. Whereas, of course, if you look at the question of the existence of nations and the interests of nations, the nation is by definition something that exists in and through time. The idea of a nation as existing only today or for the present generation is a contradiction in terms. It is something that has existed in the past, often for a very, very, very long time, and which the entire state is, in principle, in theory, morally committed to continue into the future. Here, of course, I bring out my Burkean background, Edmund Burke, that society is a contract between the living, the dead, and those yet to be born. That is a very environmentalist statement, by the way, very close to the famous quote, I can't remember who said it originally, that we've only borrowed the world from our grandchildren. So commitment to the preservation and well-being of the nation in future, in time. I see this as a very important contribution that nationalism or patriotism can make to the struggle against climate change. And the second thing, of course, is closely linked to sacrifice. How do you get ordinary people to make sacrifices in the struggle against climate change? Now here, the evidence so far has been very depressing, I have to say. In one country after another, France, the more progressive parts of the United States, you see areas where, principia, majorities vote for serious action against climate change until it becomes a question of paying higher taxes or higher fuel prices. And then, surprise, surprise, you get large majorities against action, or you get street protests, as in France. Well, once again, and this of course is an idea that has been raised. One of the ways, absolutely central way, chief way, in which you've been able to get people to make sacrifices in modern history is for the nation, especially in time of war, but also in terms of preparation for threats against the nation. Hence the cover of the British book. You can't, of course, see the title, but this is a famous Second World War poster. In the book, I go through all these, had them of course in the Soviet Union as well, all these posters from the Second World War, which were, you know, absolutely environmentalist in present terms. Recycling, car sharing, is your journey really necessary? Public transport, don't waste, you know, don't throw away your rubbish, feed it to your pig or your neighbor's pig, all these things. So sacrifice for the sake of protecting the nation. And of course, I make the point that from that point of view, the balance between so far military spending all over the world, but particularly in the United States, and what people have been prepared to pay or been asked to pay in terms of taxes in the struggle against climate change has been, you know, absolutely ridiculous. I mean, grotesque. You know, the average American paying $2,000 a year in taxes to support the Pentagon budget, and furious opposition to paying an extra $20 a year in taxes in the struggle against climate change. I need hardly tell you, a threat to the United States which exceeds the Russian threat to the United States, insofar as a Russian threat to the United States exists at all, by orders of magnitude. So nationalism and sacrifice is a central theme of the book. Finally, the last part of the book is this part is more directed specifically to the United States, and although it didn't say it, was explicitly was originally more or less of a campaign manifesto for Elizabeth Warren. She was my candidate for the presidency of the United States. Of course, she didn't get it, unfortunately, but still better than Biden won. But I say two things when it comes to struggle against climate change. First, if, as the environmentalist camp agrees, you know, climate change is not just an existential threat, but alongside nuclear weapons, the existential threat to humanity, then it must be prioritized. And it is a grave mistake to load onto it other left-wing agendas, especially cultural agendas, not necessarily economic agendas, because the book is very, very strongly in favor of what has been called a Green New Deal, because you need measures of enhanced social solidarity if you are ever going to get the population to make sacrifices in the struggle against climate change. But loading onto it additional cultural and identity politics agendas, which are absolutely calculated to alienate huge numbers of voters, working class voters who used to vote for progressive parties but no longer do. And linked to that, the argument that if we are going to see in the West really radical action to limit emissions, with all the sacrifices, the wrenching economic transformations that will demand, you need not just a Biden-like majority, a majority of the popular vote, but not a large one, and of course, a tiny majority in the Senate. You need the kind of majority that Franklin Roosevelt won in the 1930s, or unfortunately Ronald Reagan won in the 1980s, whereby you create what has been called a new dispensation, a whole new way of looking at the state and its role and the political system, which then means that not just for the term of one administration, and not just that your party wins the next election, but that the administrations from the other party govern in the same way for a generation or more to come, just as President Eisenhower and President Nixon governed as New Deal Democrats in many ways, and just as, unfortunately, President Clinton and President Obama governed as Reagan Republicans in many ways. Now, I'm of course glad that the Biden administration won. I am, alas, deeply opposed to their policies towards Russia and China. But from the point of view of climate change, I wish that they'd won a much bigger majority. And I do not believe that the environmentalist camp in the West, most of it, not all, but most of it, as presently ideologically configured, is going to win the kind of majorities necessary to enable the kind of radical change that we need. That is my summary of the book, and I very much look forward to your comments and responses.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Anatol. If we can just, if I can kick off our discussion with a brief question on something you've touched upon in your presentation, but kind of get a more concrete look into that. You gave one of the recent interviews to the Harvard's Russia Matters website on how and why the climate change agenda may be important to US-Russia relations in particular. So do you believe that there is a climate change agenda for Moscow and Washington, and as some argue, including in Russia, that it may be one of the kind of new domains for the bilateral relations? And if yes, where exactly? And if not, why not?
Well, I think to a limited degree, yes. Clearly, John Kerry and his team would like to make it so. But as we see, Kerry is supposed to go to China tomorrow. And as we see, just to be allowed by the Biden administration to go to China, he has had to make endless statements saying, of course, we won't make any concessions to the Chinese. We will not, relax our policy in any way on any other issue in dealing with China. The same, I'm afraid, will be the case if he, goes to Russia. The other thing that I'm afraid of, and that I regard as almost inevitable if the US approaches Russia in this way, is that rather than an attempt precisely to prioritize climate change and therefore reduce the importance of these, as I say in historical terms, minor issues from America's point of view, not necessarily from Russia's, that are dividing the two sides, that the US will basically just try to bully Russia again, to put pressure on Russia over limiting emissions. Will try to impose new sanctions and new tariffs. I hope that will not be the case, but I think there is a very strong risk of it. So that's what I'm afraid of in the relationship. But if it does become important, I would say there is some there is some influence in that direction in Washington, but it will become, alas, important in a negative way for relations and not a positive way.
All right, thank you very much. Before we give the floor to our discussant, Professor Anastasia Likachova, just a reminder to our listeners that you can type in your questions to our speaker in the chat box, and we'll be happy to take them shortly after our authors and our discussants' remarks. Anastasia?
Maxima, hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you for organizing such an event, for an invitation, and of course, thank you to Professor Ливен for such an amazing book. I had a chance to read it, and I really enjoyed it, as far as it touches so many issues that I profoundly worked through for many years, particularly focusing on freshwater problems in international relations. Of course, they are very closely related to climate change and its impact on international life, including international economy, international relations, and other issues. I also, when I read the book, especially the first chapters about the threats to states, that I found really extremely well funded and really important for modern discourse on the issue. I remembered very well the discussion I participated in Belfer Center about 3 years ago at Harvard University. And these discussions was mostly related to US-Russia relations, and we focused on the almost absence by the time of development agenda in the relations by very obvious reasons. And particularly we focused on the issue of climate change, and the head of the seminar, who worked for many years in American intelligence, he was very open as far as he was retired by the time, in his ideas that the particular problem of US foreign policy and strategic analysis is the lack of even special bodies that focus and evaluate climate change threats to American security at the level of intelligence. So I think that the focus that Professor Ливен makes in his book is very important and completely fits the calls of scholars across both sides of the Atlantic. I also really would like to emphasize a special focus on interdisciplinary impacts of the climate change that you focus in the book with its impacts on migration and the problems for many regions to face this migration, not only Russia. Even today, by coincidence, we have burst in news about comments of the head of Russian Meteorological Service that climate change would have a direct impact on Russian labor market, and Russia could face the challenge of migrant influx in a couple of years. So I don't know. I was sure that I was one of the first privileged readers, but it looks like Russian media also work with the material you focus on your book. And today we have already busted about discussions. Does Russia needs migrants? How we can manage this challenge? How this challenge was managed in previous decades and regions. I would like particularly to focus on the consequences that are partially covered in the book, but can have really important impact as far as we see now on climate discussion now between Russia and Europe, and the focus on Green Deal that now overwhelms the Russian expert discourse and media discourse. In your book, you absolutely clearly mention these special aspects, how this European Green Deal is important for European identity, for their self-estimation. As many Europeans now write, it's more like our man in the moon, the Green Deal. So the impact is right there. But what is really clear now that if Europe would completely follow this nationalist, or I don't know, supranationalist focus, other countries that are mostly exporters to Europe could counteract. So this challenge of controversial nationalist approach to climate agenda, it's already a challenge for international relations, and the risks that even absolutely trans-border challenge that our planet, our countries face should push us towards some cooperative, not even action of mode, but at least dialogue, risks to move very quickly to the battle of taxes, non-formal trade barriers, just in order to protect somehow domestic industries and get as much as possible from this economic impact of climate change. I completely share the point you do in chapters, in particular chapters 3 and chapter 2, about migration and about progress. That the very important shifts that we face, that we observe now, is a reconsideration of climate change as just a pure challenge, pure threat towards a source of inspiration for business, for creative industries, for people to reshape their lives, to reshape their mode of production, to reshape their education even. And I would say that it's some kind of best case scenario, because if we take a look on some very particular region that face now this climate change pressure, the Arctic region, we see that unfortunately by now processes are mostly absolutely controversial, and you clearly mentioned these risks in the other chapters. Particularly for the Arctic, I think that's a region when Russian and American interests in the field of climate change climate change threat are the most extreme, not just by the fact of extreme north, but just as we consider Arctic as the natural lab for climate change. And that's the lab where all the processes of climate change develop 4 to 5 times quicker than in other regions. And as far as Russia controls almost half of the Arctic, it means that not Russia would protect it, but also it means that Russia is responsible for this half of the Arctic, while America is presented in the region by Alaska and by its rising ambitions in the Arctic field. The recent updates in American military doctrine that particularly includes the point that all armies, all soldiers have to pass through some Arctic trainings in coming years, even if they serve nearby Mexican border. That's a very nervous symptom. While we have this discourse, it's very hard to move towards some progressive discourse about climate change. And the problem is that if we don't do it, if our countries will just follow the militarization track in the region, that they actually do by now, in its very essence, global climate challenge can be properly adapted in coming years. And the tensions that Russia and US have in the region, I think they would have very clear and direct negative impact on global progress in the field of climate change. Otherwise, only if countries would be able to overpass the discourse and limit the degree of confrontation by other regions trying to split military and climate aspects of their relations. It's extremely hard, it's extremely difficult, because even if you focus on surveillance of glaciers, you do surveillance on glaciers or you do surveillance on fleet. So these issues are very closely interconnected, but I think that it's not just symbolic, it's very illustrative that Lavrov talked with Kerry recently, and Arctic definitely was on the table, also including the fact that Russia takes chairmanship in Arctic Council this May, and will hold it for 2 years. Unfortunately, by now, Arctic Council, that used to be just a very important forum of Arctic and non-Arctic states, but this forum was able to produce some declarations, joint statements, launch working groups. In recent 2 years, it turned into another theater of US-Chinese confrontation with famous demarche of Mike Pompeo. And the risks that for coming 2 years, it will turn into playground for US-Russia confrontation, these risks are very high. So to my opinion, this book, it should be not just read and studied by students, it should be well developed in coming years, because the issues to evaluate and assess that you just mentioned in the book, they are multiplying very quickly. And the last but not the least point that I would like to focus on, that also meets this challenge of nationalism, progress, and obvious threats, relies to climate finance or green finance. I do study a lot of sanction policies, and it's very interesting to watch on how some potentially sanctioned institutions in Russia try to develop this green agenda, green finance agenda in their business activities, also as a part of strategy to either to avoid or to lesser the sanction pressure. I think that it will be very important indicator to watch in coming years to which extent US and lesser Europe, but still would be ready to impose unilateral sanctions on the enterprises, on financial institutions in Russia, China, maybe in other countries, to their partners, of course, as a secondary sanctions that deal with adaptation to climate change. Because if they will, we must admit that nationalism clearly won, and that climate change still is considered as a secondary threat compared to traditional hard security challenges. If not, so maybe it will be a symptom of really profound shift of modus operandi of American foreign policy, European foreign policy, and maybe foreign policy of other countries. So summing up, first of all, again, I completely welcome the book and the issues it raises, because we know tons of materials about climate change and international economy, social impacts of climate change. But the question that was set very sharply in the book, what about climate change and still the major actor in international relations, states? I think that this question is extremely important, and states still hesitate to openly declarate whether they do bet on traditional security or they're ready to downgrade these priorities in favor of climate change. Speaking about some particular regional aspects, I think that especially this regional focus that is transborder, particularly the Arctic region, is very important and worth to be watched in coming years. And the indicator that really is interesting to consider as an adding variable in coming years to the issue you raise is the mix of climate change policies, unilateral sanction policies, and evaluation of national security threats to watch in coming years. I would maybe stop here and we'll have some time to Q&A.
Thank you very much, Dr. Likacho and Anastasia. Appreciate your comment. Professor Ливен, would you like to say a few things?
Yes, I mean, just very briefly, the US approach to the Arctic reduces me to despair, frankly. I hope that this will change a bit under the Biden administration. But all these supposed military threats in the Arctic, it reminds me of something that the British Prime Minister Lord Salisbury said in the 19th century, that if the British generals had their way, they would get him to pay to defend the moon against an attack from Mars. You know, so much of this is about, frankly, the generals and admirals just wanting to bolster their budgets. It is, in military terms, this is not a serious issue. You know, invasion, military threats across the Arctic, it's, you know, it just, anyway, yeah, I mean, ideally, this should be, and of course, as you say, it also totally misses the most important points, which are the warming of the Arctic, the melting of the ice cap, and the melting of the permafrost, which should be made the absolute foundation of talks, negotiations in the Arctic Council. On Europe, yes, I mean, well, as with America, I'm very afraid of new tariffs and sanctions in that regard. And it's one reason, of course, why well, I mean, you could look at this from two angles. I mean, on the one hand, we need to improve relations between Russia and Europe, but we also need to look at particular ways of starting to do that. And the beginning of cooperation on action against climate change is, you know, one way of doing that. Now, inevitably, there will be pressure from the European Union on Russia. At least I say inevitably, not if Le Pen wins in France next year. Unfortunately, if Le Pen wins in France, it will also be very bad for the struggle against climate change, but at least it won't be directed against Russia. But what I've been, you know, saying to the Europeans is, for God's sake, if you're going to put pressure on Russia over climate change, then you've got to offer new forms of cooperation and joint activity and joint financing and joint research and development as well, you know, if you're going to get Russia to do anything. You know, with Russia, as with Iran, as with Cuba, and as they're going to find out with China, by God, if they haven't already, simply trying to push countries on everything simultaneously does not work. They push back. Russia has pushed back. So anyway, that's, you know, the argument to be made. I've said to every European diplomat, politician I've ever talked to about this, you know, stop shouting and look at whatever fields you can use as the beginning of a foundation for working together with Russia. I always say this about Afghanistan as well. We have a common interest in fighting against terrorism, and we have a common interest, which the Americans don't have to nearly the same extent, in fighting against heroin, which is, of course, a colossal threat to Russia and to Europe. Let us really talk about how we can do things together on that and coordinate policy. Well, it hasn't worked so far, but I shall keep trying. Just one last thing, you're absolutely right on the issue of water. And when it comes to the more immediate threat to states, and also the crucial area of water, here, you know, my background in India, Pakistan, South Asia was one of the things that really alerted me to the danger of climate change. Because, as I said, and as various reports have brought out, there's a series of reports from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, for example, and reports from the World Bank. It would not take much acceleration of existing water shortages, growing water shortages, or a very much higher rise in temperatures above their existing levels in South Asia to bring about profound agricultural and social crises. And here, you know, we're not looking at the start of the next century, we're looking already at the middle of this century. And of course, this is an area with, if you put all the countries of the area together, more than a quarter of the entire world's population. I mean, if they start to go downhill fast, nobody else is going to be immune to the results. So thank you very much for those remarks and comments.
Thank you very much. We have a couple of questions already.
Maxim, excuse me, can I use the power discussion and just give a very brief comment on water? I think that's the area that so purely illustrates this capacity of states to change their approach to the problem depending on the degree of its sharpness. When I started to work on my thesis about like 12 years ago, the coming hot points to watch about coming water wars, the number one was Syria. There was a pure idea that the next war between Turkey, Syria, and Iraq will be about water. Syria is an ongoing civil war for the last almost 11 years, and it has very moderate relations to water problems. In the 90s, there was very popular the idea that Arab-Israeli conflict is profoundly based on the control over Jordan River and waters in the area in general. The last 30 years proved that if Arab-Israeli conflict could be resolved by water supplies only, I think that many American presidents, as well as French ones, would spend avian supplies to the region just to solve the problem. And here I think that we can find some roots for optimism. If the consequences or the situation becomes really dramatic and sharp, states manage to change their priorities. And particularly in the water field, we observe it. And states still aren't ready to openly turn political conflicts into armed conflicts because of water. But the challenge that states failed to manage by now is how to manage water conflicts when the source of conflict is not how like an upstate country, how upstream country behaves, but just because of the rising pressure of economic development on water systems that pushes migrants, that pushes urbanization, that leads to rise of favelas and so forth, so on. So to some extent, I think particularly in the water field, in international river basins, states still don't really know how to react properly to these exogenous climate change driving water challenges. And some solutions can be found in the field of technology, but the most of the solution can be found only in changing of whole economic models, not of particular state, but of the regions. And it's a very big talk to watch.
No, absolutely.
Thank you very much. Very, very interesting. We have, let's open the floor to questions and comments from our audience. We have our colleague from Foreign Ministry, Oksana.
Thank you very much for your thorough analysis and for dwelling on different aspects of the climate change, of the critically important climate change agenda. And my question is, to your mind, what's wrong with Russia's environmental policy? How should it be modified to become the effective tool of boosting Russia's influence in world politics? Thank you.
Yeah, and as a follow-up, if I may, there's the second question in the chat. Probably you've seen it because the Higher School of Economics, their small research team led by Professor Sergei Karaganov yesterday, they presented their report. And so the question is, have you seen it? Have you read it? And if so, is this compatible with Western approaches? If yes, why not? Perhaps if you have not, then we can forward it to you.
Please do. I heard of it, but I haven't had a chance to look at it yet since it obviously came out. The problem for Russia, of course, is like Doha, like Qatar, where I now live, is obviously simply that the Russian economy does depend. I would say it's not as important as people in the West think, but nonetheless to a very important degree on fossil fuels. On the export of fossil fuels for energy, and on obviously the domestic economy, on the availability of cheap fossil fuels. It is going to be a very difficult economic challenge for Russia if indeed the world does move rapidly away from this. Although Russia, like Qatar, I think can rely to some extent on the probability that gas will be the last to go, both because it is the least dangerous in terms of emissions, and because, of course, so many countries in Western Europe and elsewhere are so dependent on gas for their energy that it's difficult to imagine how that can be quickly changed. As far as Russian international policy is concerned, I would hope that there are we've mentioned the Arctic. If Russia could have, launch an imaginative initiative trying to focus international attention on the real dangers of the Arctic in terms of climate change. Obviously, the melting of the ice cap, the threat of methane release from the permafrost, where Russian territory is the most important and dangerous source of that, simply because of course, of the scale of it. And then propose cooperation on that. And of course, stress the need for international financing of it with Russian participation. But obviously, Russia will need and deserves to have assistance in this regard as well. So whatever Russian diplomacy can do to move the discussion in the West towards these issues, and to bring out the fact that Russia is simply central to them, whether it's in terms of forests swallowing up the carbon emissions, or dangers, permafrost and the ice cap. But trying to really not take control of this agenda, but really to position Russia as a leading voice on this subject, trying to talk to other countries on this subject. And, well, obviously I would say this since I wrote a book on the subject, but, specifically, I think when it comes to the Arctic, trying to make the case that the other issues that have been raised are just not so important. In any case, Russia is not presenting an actual threat in this regard. Now, but of course, to be effective, this would have to be combined with much more rigorous Russian actions at home. And here, the key issue is coal in the short term. Incidentally, I mean, another point there, which I raise in the book, which has also made me very unpopular, of course, among environmentalists in the West, but where Russia could perhaps play a useful role, at least from my point of view. Of course, Chernobyl didn't help in that regard, but is in emphasizing the continued centrality of nuclear energy to the struggle to limit emissions. Of course, nuclear energy with enhanced security measures, but also research into new and safer forms of nuclear energy. This is something which Russia is bound to do, given the importance of its nuclear supply. And I think that not that this will make Russia popular in the environmentalist camp in the West, at least, or in most Western countries, but I think this is a very important contribution that Russia can make to the climate change debate. Just emphasize the centrality of nuclear energy, the very limited risk of nuclear energy compared, not just the risk of climate change, but as I point out in the book, as others have pointed out, at the absolute outside in terms of estimates, you've had a few tens of thousands of indirect deaths as a result of nuclear accidents. By the way, Fukushima was described as a nuclear disaster. It wasn't. Every year, between 7 and 9 million people die as a result of air pollution from fossil fuels. For God's sake, do the math. Here, I think, an intellectually coherent and intellectually quite tough Russian contribution to the debate would be useful. But I'm not saying that this is going to be easy, given, of course, the state of Russia's relations between Russia and the West, and of course, so much of the thinking in the West today.
All right, thank you very much. We have another question from another colleague from the Higher School of Economics, Professor Andrei Isarov. Your mic.
Yes, thank you, Professor Ливен. I would like to start first with a comment on France, which you made. I think it's a very good example against, to put it in a vulgar way, against that limousine liberalism that you, as far as I could get, criticized in your book. That story with the protest, exactly what you are saying, I think. But my question concerns the larger issues. How would you comment on the growing demographic strength, the growing presence of weaker states in the world? If you could compare it, for example, with the Second World War, and the states which may not so easily take well, it's not easy for anyone, but may not easily or easier take the necessary measures against the climate change. If we expect something from the richest states, which from the states which proved how effectively they can work, for example, against the coronavirus epidemics, like in East Asia, how can we expect something like that from states which cannot easily undertake such measures and implement them?
Well, the argument I make in the book is that, after all, around 2/3 of global emissions, of carbon emissions, are produced by only 6 countries, if you count the European Union, now unfortunately without Britain, of course. And I say about the whole, international negotiation process on climate change, led by the United Nations, Kyoto, Copenhagen, Paris, that frankly, it might have been better from the point of view of emissions, actually not to ignore, but not actually to involve most of the countries of the world, because their contribution to emissions is actually very small. And that essentially, if you can get common action and common standards by China, America, India, Russia, Japan, and the European Union, then you haven't, of course, absolutely solved the problem. But after all, ultimately, there is just one thing that we're trying to do, that is limit carbon emissions. That means, of course, limiting them from the places where most of them are happening, which is the 6 countries that I've mentioned. Of course, China the biggest, but India growing very fast as well. So I don't think that we actually need to go to the poorest countries of the world and say, you've got to do this, you've got to do that, because from the point of view of simply the quantity of emissions, it doesn't matter very much. Now, that can change, of course, if countries grow greatly in terms of their carbon emissions. Growing countries in rapidly growing economies in Asia and Africa could make a big difference, but so far they're not. And then, as far as those countries are concerned, I think there are 2 approaches which are closely linked. The first is to make the point, look, Bangladesh, for example, above all, of course, but countries in West Africa as well, Indonesia, stop. We've no need to phrase it so harshly, but justice and arguing about the past from your point of view, not ours, misses the point. All the carbon goes into the same atmosphere, and you are the most endangered. You, in the short to medium term, not us. So it is actually in your, don't say, we need justice, we need massive assistance before we're going to do anything. Look at your own interests. You're going to be the ones who are going to be suffering drought first. You're the ones who are going to be suffering possibly existential threats of flooding, in the case of Bangladesh first. But actually, so far, that kind of discussion, in a way, doesn't need to happen. We've got to get agreement between these 6 countries or blocks. And if we can do that, then there has already been a colossal contribution to limiting emissions. And I think, from that point of view, we're terribly worried, of course, about ongoing Chinese coal burning, India still more. But at least compared to when I first started looking at this issue and talking to the Indians about it, there was, throughout much of the Indian establishment, particularly on the Hindu nationalist side, real climate change denial, rejection of this as a serious threat. Today, you get much, much less of this. There really is an awareness in the Indian elites. And this also, was partly responsible for my attention to the issue of nationalism. It's not that the Indian elites give a damn about humanity, not to put too fine a point on it, they don't. But they are beginning really to understand the threat to India. And, especially the Modi government, of course, they are Indian nationalists, and they want, they are convinced, like the Chinese, that they represent a civilization which is thousands and thousands of years old. That's what they think, anyway. And they're determined that it should continue to be so. And they're beginning to focus on the fact, as I say, this World Bank prediction that if climate change continues unchecked, whether the carbon comes from America or from India or from China, but of course more and more of it is coming from India, that the whole dream, the longer term danger is existential, but even in the shorter term, the next generation, you may see the effects of climate change in India becoming so severe that Indian economic growth basically goes down again. And all the Indian hopes and dreams of India becoming a superpower collapse as a result of climate change. So I think, you know, let us concentrate on the big emitters and see what they can agree on. And then beyond that, of course, it's a question of concentrating on the most endangered large states around the world, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Nigeria, and seeing what the developed world can do to help them in terms of resilience, in terms of, you know, trying to prevent the worst effects of climate change and trying to prevent social collapse as a result. But I have to say, when it comes to government policy in some of these countries, you know, because there's a rather glib environmentalist argument, or sort of left environmentalist argument, you know, against taking action to prevent migration. Oh, but of course we should, you know, we should put aid into Nigeria or Pakistan or whatever, and, you know, try to transform those systems. Well, you know, good luck on that one. If you look at standards of governance in Nigeria, for example, you know, since independence, nobody really knows what to do in terms of changing that country. So of course we should go on looking at it, but we shouldn't have any illusions that this is going to be an easy process, you know, to strengthen countries like Nigeria, you know, against the effects of climate change. So the best thing that we can all do if we want to help the poorer countries of the world is not to put money into them. So much money, frankly, has been thrown down the drain in that way by aid over the years. It is simply to limit emissions, our emissions. If we can limit our emissions, that is the best way that we can help these countries against climate change, I would say. So in a sense, let's concentrate on what we can do, the developed world, and that to limit emissions, and in that way, help the rest of the world. Because it's something that we can do that is crucially important, you know, without getting, you know, to be perfectly honest, you know, I've been working on Pakistan for more than 30 years now, and I'm not much further ahead on, you know, what realistically can be done to transform Pakistan than I was in 1988. So, sorry to sound, that's my realist coming out. Cynic, if you will.
Well, we'll have another question, in a way challenging or asking you to explain your kind of realist standing in the Q&A. Our colleague from the Center, Olga Rebro, asks, so you compare the response to climate change by nation state as pandemic, and she's saying that the pandemic is a type of threat equally felt by nation states, whereas climate change, as you mentioned, brings about disaster to some countries and opportunities to others. So to put it in blunt realist terms, the latter will have to make sacrifices for the benefit of the former. And she's saying, thus the problem by nature demands a collective action for global good. In other words, liberal solutions. So how do you reconcile this? And the kind of the second part of her question is, how do you convince a country that benefits from ultimate change to make sacrifices, right? To solve the problem of others, rather than prepare for problems that it will face in the future, such as the migration instability along the borders and things like this. I think it's a very interesting question.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is where I think migration is key. But migration together with other pressures on our society, and I talk in the book about the impact of automation and artificial intelligence potentially on jobs in developed economies. My point being that if you look at social strains which are already existing in the developed world, add climate change and increased migration to that, and this idea that some countries will benefit or will not suffer so much actually becomes wrong. Because, as I said about Russia, of course, as you well know, there is very widespread discourse in Russia about how Russia will benefit from climate change. You'll be growing oranges in Siberia. I had this conversation with a governor in Siberia a number of years ago, and he was saying this to me: we're going to be growing oranges in Khanty-Mansiysk. And I said, you do realize you're going to be sharing these oranges with tens of millions of starving refugees, you know, from South Asia and the Middle East. And he looked at me and said, oh. So my point is, you see, and of course you get people saying this in America as well, you get people saying this in Canada. But the point is, of course, the direct physical effects on them will be far less in the short to medium term than they will be on South Asia, West Africa, for example. But there are two counter arguments to that. The first is that you won't be able to insulate yourself from the indirect effects, or at least, as I say, I mean, only by methods so ferocious that, well, certainly Western democracy would fly out of the window. But Russia, you know, with these borders, huge borders with Asia, it's just not realistic to think that Russia can survive in isolation from catastrophes across much of Asia. That's the first thing. But the second thing is, it is this question of tipping points, feedback loops. What happens if there is massive, rapid release of methane from the permafrost, for example, which drives much, much, much more rapid and extreme climate change, 2 degrees to 3 degrees, 3 degrees to 4, 4 degrees to 5. Now, if that happens, then the speed and extent of change will be such that it will erase differences between states. We'll basically all be in the same boat. No state and no organized society, however rich and however northern, will be able to survive that kind of change that rapidly. In other words, modern civilization will collapse. And, you know, as I said in my talk, the threat, we don't know how great this threat is. We can't put a figure on it in terms of risk. But, I mean, if you look at the scientific evidence and the warnings, and, for example, the impact of methane as a greenhouse gas, it should be absolutely obvious that this threat is real. You know, the possibility of an end to modern civilization as a result of runaway climate change is real, it exists. Now, at that point, it really will not matter whether you're living in Moscow, in Dhaka, in Lagos, in Nigeria, in Washington, DC, or wherever. We're all going to be in the same boat, and the same boat will be sinking. So I think that's, you know, the other key answer to that point.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. We have our last question, and about 8 minutes before we wrap up our event, from our colleague Nikita Lipanov, please.
Yeah, thanks a lot. First of all, I would like to thank Professor Ливен for delivering such an insightful speech. Thank you so much. Well, as the topic of our today's book talk is climate change and the nation state, in my question, I'd like to address climate change as a matter of domestic policy. We all know that populist parties are those, or just populists in general, are those who use objective threats to society as a tool of their political game. So in your opinion, to what extent are green parties actually populists? And can we talk about green populism nowadays?
That is a fascinating question. And yes, I mean, there is an extent. For example, the Greens in Germany, I think, are a particular case of this, where, you know, there is this, you know, absolute hysteria on the subject of nuclear energy. Really, I mean, appealing to public fears, you know, not to rational argument or rational discussion. And of course, I'm very sorry to say that ever since the days of Joschka Fischer, the Greens have actually become pretty hawkish in international affairs as well, at least towards Russia, partly because of this, addiction to the human rights agenda, and they don't seem to realize just how much this is, playing to the interests of the military-industrial complex, and of American imperialism, and so forth. So yes, I think there is a green populism, and it's something that I think we also need to struggle against, because in the end, I mean, of course, you've got to appeal to people's interests. And I mean, the appeal to people to fear when it comes to climate change, I mean, is necessary. We should be afraid. We should be very afraid. And I would say, the indirect effects in terms of simply a degree of migration which one could not seriously dream of assimilating or controlling. That's also a realistic fear. But and hence my Salisbury quote. We're, as a species, so many people have said this, the human species is very bad at assessing comparative risks. Look at the hysteria in America after 9/11 over terrorism, which turned out to be a dreadful but one-off threat. So I do think that while on the one hand my book suggests how we can generate the right kinds of fears, but those fears have to be based on real evidence and rational argument. And I think that as far as climate change and its indirect effects are concerned, the evidence is there. It's just a question of, if you like, packaging it in the way that will convince enough people, including those people in our security establishments and those voters on the right who have not yet been convinced, but who we need to convince, if we are going to get the sort of action which I believe necessary to limit emissions.
All right. Thank you. Well, one last comment, if we may. We have four minutes to go, and I think you actually mentioned that already. It comes from our colleague Grigoria Regan, who is asking what are the channels for communication on climate change between the U.S. and Russia? The role for Secretary Kerry. Actually, I was just going to mention that President Biden just called Putin. And among the issues they discussed, at least judging by the presser, by the Kremlin and the White House, was climate change, actually kind of echo in our presentation. Do you have anything to add to that? And then I'll just quickly then go to Anastasia, and then she perhaps will say a few things about the report that the Higher School of Economics presented yesterday, and we'll wrap up.
Well, I mean, obviously, I hope that the Biden administration and Kerry will attempt cooperation and will avoid the kind of utterly counterproductive rhetoric and insults that they directed both at China and at Russia. So I mean, language counts. That one should start with cooperative language, and then yes, I mean, begin to focus on areas where Russia is key. Where you simply cannot exclude Russia from the discussion. Well, unfortunately, of course, cooperation in space is now declining again. But, for a long time, the one area that continued irrespective of geopolitical tensions after the end of the Cold War was cooperation in space. I would like, because there was an underlying belief that was somehow part of a general human effort, a common human effort, in an area where confrontation had not existed and should not exist, and also a new area for humanity where cooperation was possible. I would like to see us getting back to that in the area of space, and I would like to see the area of action on climate change envisaged in that kind of way, and joint institutions created accordingly. That's what I'd like to see. I'm I'm not naively optimistic about whether it will happen, but that's what I would like to happen.
Thank you. Dr. Lukachow, a few things? No? I think she abandoned us. Well, anyway, I think the link is in the chat box for all those of you interested in the report on climate issues that was presented by our colleagues yesterday. Thank you so very much for your presentation, Professor Ливен, and thanks everyone for your patience, participation, and questions. Actually, I think it's a fascinating discussion, and it's actually a fascinating issue. It's just perhaps it has not entirely sunk into our conscious its importance. But I think it will be of increasing importance over the days. Oh, Nancy is back in. Dr. Lukachow, would you like to say a few things about the report? Because I was about to wrap up.
We can't hear you.
You're muted.
Oh, yeah, I was so pathetic. So thank you, yeah, for the opportunity to.
Perhaps there won't be any opportunity for us to engage in. Anyway, well, thank you very much. I think we'll have to wrap up, and then those of you interested in the report that our colleagues produced, please follow the link. Those of you interested in Professor Liven's book, I do suggest you go online and buy it. It should be out. Is it a new edition out in May, or it's a
new paperback, updated paperback edition next month?
Got it. Well, thank you very much. Just a little teaser for our next book talk, where we'll be lucky, if everything goes well, to host Rose Guttmuller with her phenomenal portfolio on arms control. Talk to us in May about arms non-proliferation and arms control and all this exciting stuff. So stay with us and follow the CAAS Book Talk Series. Thank you so much. Have a good evening.
Thanks a lot. And I hope to meet you all in Russia once COVID.
Likewise.
Sorry for this misconnections. Thank you for organization too, and Professor Ливен. Hope we'll be able to meet in Moscow soon, and by the time definitely discuss the report made both in Russian and English, and the link for Russian text is in group chat. Hope that the translation will be able by the end of next week, because we will have an open discussion soon.
Great.
And definitely welcoming the topic. We work on it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.